Just a minute. Right. Okay. Afternoon, everybody. So we have Ms. Aathira Nandan, research scholar in the department, working under the guidance of Dr. M. B. Narayanan, defending her dissertation for PhD title, Gender as in Performance, Textual Negotiations on Kathakali. We have with us Dr. Chitra Panikkar from Bangalore University. Is it Bangalore University or Bangalore North? Whatever.
Bangalore University.
Bangalore University, the proper university. Okay. So most of us are very familiar with her. She's been a good friend of the department. She has been here several times. So just a few words of introduction by way of formality. Her PhD was on James Joyce and Marcel Proust. That is from Kerala University. Then she worked as a resident scholar at the James Joyce Foundation, Zurich, Switzerland, for a year. And then afterwards, on a return to India, she joined Hyderabad Central University. She was the reader there for some time, and then she joined the Linguistics and Translation Studies department before coming to Bangalore University. And most of her work has been on James Joyce. She has translated 8 chapters of Ulysses into Malayalam, and she continues to translate literary and critical text from Malayalam into English and vice versa, a two-way translator. Currently, she heads the Department of English, Bangalore University, and we're happy to have her here. So this is roughly the sketch of today's program. After I taper off, you'll have Dr. Chitra Panikkar taking over as the chairperson of the session, and she'll be asking the candidate, Ms. Aathira Nandan, to present her dissertation, after which she would be putting in questions, suggestions, etc. to her, and then probably the session will be thrown open to the audience, the others, or the students, research scholars, and others present here. And at the end, the candidate would be responding to the program, the session here. And then the supervisor, Dr. M. B. Narayanan, would be delivering a formal vote of thanks. This is roughly the sketch of the program. So I invite Dr. Chitra Panikkar to take over the session.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be with all of you here. As I said earlier, all are friends, and I would also be happy to be the chief examiner for Aathira Nandan, because I've also enjoyed reading her thesis. It took me back to days when with Appukuttan Nair sir, I used to sit and watch Kathakali performances Friday after Friday, at the Margi Center in Trivandrum. It took me back to those days. So after an interval, I was revisiting Kathakali, and Aathira helped me to, kind of remember a whole lot of things that I had forgotten for quite some time. So thank you, Aathira, for taking me into your thesis. And I invite Aathira Nandan to give her presentation on gender constructs in Kathakali. I think the thesis is formally titled Gender as/in Performance, Textual Negotiations in Kathakali. So we are all eager to listen to you. And please don't be nervous, because this is my first PhD Viva, where I'm chief examiner online, and I'm as nervous as you. So please carry on, confidently and with the passion that you brought to your work. Let us see it on display here. Aathira.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin my presentation. As already mentioned, the title of my thesis is Gender as/in Performance, Textile Negotiations in Kathakali. As a product of the patriarchal society of Kerala, the text of Kathakali works on the politics of exclusion based on gender, intersected by caste, class, and other aspects particular to the society of Kerala. The spaces associated with Kathakali, Kalari, Aniyara, Aranga, and the space for watching performance are all gendered. Along with this, there is an engendering of the bodies which perform Kathakali. Both the construction of the gendered spaces and the engendering of performers' bodies do not happen exactly in tune with the gendering that happen in the society outside the text. The gender performed in Kathakali is highly performative, displaced, but parallel to the gender paradigms of the society. The gender constructed in the text of Kathakali gets constructed through the literary text, training in Kalari, Taudyatridam, a blending of dance, music, and percussion, and audiences' perceptions. The first chapter of my thesis is titled as Politics of Exclusion. So this goes along, this tries to trace the evolution of concepts like sex, gender, and sexuality, and also the politics of exclusion practiced by ideological apparatuses of patriarchy like family, religion, educational institutions, and workplaces. Many of the taken for granted notions related to sex, gender, and sexuality have been problematized. But at the same time, patriarchy persists with its dominance, appearing in new manifestations each time. In the second chapter, cultural manifestations of politics of exclusion based on gender is analyzed. Some of the performance texts like ballet, theatre, music, cinema, all over the world, across the world, within India and in the society of Kerala are analyzed. Like other art forms of India, Kathakali continues to represent the gender politics of exclusion in the patriarchal society, from its origin through its evolutionary stages and in its current form. The third chapter of the thesis analyzes the construction of gender at the level of literature, that is through Atakadas. Fourth chapter analyzes the construction of gender at the performance level, and fifth chapter gives a discursive analysis of some of the audience texts from the 1960s to the present. Patriarchy has been a norm in most of the societies for a long time. Its manifestations are not monolithic. In whichever form it appears, it remains largely imperceptible and hence unquestionable even today. David Bookbinder, in his work Studying Men and Masculinities, analyzes formal and symbolic masculinities. Power among men is not equally divided, but most of them benefit from a patriarchal dividend, according to R.W. Connell. Most of the institutions are controlled by men, and they have an upper hand in almost all the decision-making processes. Patriarchy maintains its supremacy by punishing its deviance and reinvents itself in new forms whenever there is a major unrest of any kind. Sex and gender have been terms used interchangeably until Simone de Beauvoir came up with Simone de Beauvoir saw gender as a socio-cultural construct. Patriarchy has garnered the assistance of scientific discourses which analyzed anatomy and essential features of a male and a female. Male is structured by a penis and female with a vagina. There may be aberrations, but they were perceived as abnormalities. Sexual roles, gender roles and sexual behavior were supposed to flow naturally from one's anatomy or sex. The discussions on sex is concluded here with Judith Butler's argument that sex is already gendered. She considered that sex is as much a construct as gender. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her work A Vindication of the Rights of Women, explains the qualities associated with each gender as mere human virtues and not by nature gendered. She argued against the gender stereotyping, which begins at the stage of childhood itself. According to her, restricting women's chances for education and profession is restricting their chance to live fully as human beings. According to Simone de Beauvoir, masculinity and femininity are ideals constructed by the society to guide men and women. Role fixing starts from the familial atmosphere and continues in the discourses which boys and girls encounter. Simone de Beauvoir points at the gendered nature of some of the professions and insists that women need to regain their subjectivity by engaging in these professions and also politics and sports. Virginia Woolf problematized gender roles and gendered spaces in the society and subjectivity of women in her work A Room of One's Own. As I have already mentioned, Judith Butler saw gender as a performative, and it is the performance of gender that results in gender, and it does not exist prior to this performance, according to her. For one to get assigned as a male or a female, one needs to use these performative acts and repeat them on a daily basis. Gender is an issue taken up by feminists of the first wave initially, and it gained wide acceptance, and masculinity studies has emerged as a new branch in the field of gender studies. Masculinity is often seen as monolithic in opposition to femininity. Masculinity studies see that there are differences among men as there are differences between men and women. This study further moves on to sexuality, the concept of sexuality. Sexuality is seen through the theorizations of Sigmund Freud, who saw sexuality as heteronormative, and Nancy Chaudreau, who problematized the notion that motherhood is natural. Sorry. Michael Foucault. According to Michael Foucault, sexuality is reduced in the society as to mere heteronormativity and reproduction. Helen Sissou and Luce Irigaray saw women's sexuality as an unspoken subject and stressed that women need to rewrite on themselves and their sexual desires. These theorizations, along with the gendering that is practiced in familial, religious, educational, professional spaces, are analyzed to understand the construction of gender in the text of Kathakali. The second chapter analyzes the cultural manifestations of the politics of exclusion based on gender. The performance texts analyzed here are ballet, theater, cinema, music, sports, internet, teleserials, advertisements, and politics. Male body is a site of contestations in both Western and Indian societies. A male performer is under the danger of objectification and feminization as he becomes subject to gaze. Masculinity and femininity as defined in the texts of cinema are discussed in the theorizations of Laura Mulvey, Teresa de Lauretis, Cassandra Stover, Jacob Smith, Callum Coppola, and Mercury Michel. To foreground the gender performance in the text of Kathakali, some of the terms related to performance studies are used and analyzed in the thesis, like liminality, cross-dressing, performativity, based on Richard Schechner's performance studies. According to Schechner, performance encompasses every act of daily life. Performativity embraces all these acts and also the construction of social realities like gender and race. Liminality is yet another theme which is discussed in performance studies as part of performance studies. During a performance, a performer moves from his or her real self to a transposed self. Cross-dressing, another technique employed in the performances, upsets gendered societies, as it seems to suggest that gender can be performed. The discussion further moves on to other literary and performance texts like Odissi, Kathak, Tumri, Kuchipudi in the Indian context. Gender representations in these texts are intersected by caste and class identities. Purity and chastity are ensured among upper caste women by endorsing concepts like Padivratam. During the freedom movement, femininity came to be allegorical of the Mother India. Colonial intervention in the femininity concept resulted in the anti-Nauch movement. A historical analysis of the performance texts like Kuchipudi, Odissi, Kathak show a history of appropriation of the creative genius of women performers. These art forms are sanitized of their vulgar connections and are hailed to be contributions of male performers. But the body movements which these dance forms seem to demand are feminine and in opposition to the ideal codes of conduct of male bodies, which restrict men from entering the profession as dancers, but they could enter only as masters. Dance Like a Man by Mahesh Dattani and its film adaptation directed by Pamela Rooks show that patriarchy is oppressive to men also. This play portrays the conflicts in the mind of Jayaraj, a dancer who could not find a place in the field of dance and outside. The next part of the chapter discusses the socio-cultural scenario of Kerala during the 17th century and before. Before the establishment of Brahminical hegemony, Kali cult prevailed in the society of Kerala, as Chelanat Achudamenon explicates in his work Keralathile Kali Seva. The power of mother goddesses disintegrated with the advent of Shaiva, Vaishnava cults and other male gods. The mother goddesses were either sidelined or appropriated by the male god cult. The ways of worship also was influenced, and blood cult and fire cult were part of the rituals performed to worship the mother goddesses. Blood cult came to be considered as primitive and uncultured. Masculinity and femininity were redefined with the Brahminical influence, and intellectual men got upper hand over men who worked with their bodies, who did manual labor. Women came to be considered as objects and goods of exchange for healthy political relations. Women's role in production of society came to be reduced to reproduction. The literary texts which represented the feudal times work on male fantasy, and women's sexuality are portrayed with fetish and phobia, deeply embedded in the male psyche. Yakshi cult, which was prevalent during the feudal times in different parts of Kerala, is a projection of this male psyche. Kathakali is a product of the feudal society, such a feudal society, and necessarily show tendencies of appropriation. Unlike other art forms, Kutha or Kudiyatam, the text of Kathakali can be considered as more popular as it was not performed for a limited audience in temple premises, but in more public spaces. And most of the practitioners of Kathakali were Nair men. And the language used was Sanskrit and Malayalam, a blend of Sanskrit and Malayalam. The gender construction in the text of Kathakali need to be studied, analyzed in the context of all these aspects, along with the establishment of a performance tradition. The gender that gets constructed in the text of Kathakali is performative and gets constructed through the performance traditions, evolution of the performance traditions, beginning with Ramanattam stories of Kottarakara Tamburan, Vettathu system, Kottayam stories of Kottayathu Tamburan, Kalladikodan system, Kaplingadan system, and Kalluvazhi system. Institutionalization in the field of Kathakali began with the foundation of Kerala Kalamandalam. It questioned the supremacy of upper caste agenda, masculine agenda. The gender construction in the text of Kathakali gets influenced by the difference in the performance traditions, north and south, in advent of women performers and the performers from lower castes. The characters that get portrayed in the text of Kathakali are character prototypes, Pachakatti, Kari, Tadi, and Minikam, and based on the caste demarcations in the society to a certain extent. The patriarchal tropes like objectification of women's body, heteronormativity, purity and honor, violation and mutilation of women's bodies, objectification of women's body, restriction of the mobility of women, all work in the literary level at the level of, in the literary text at the level of writers and characters, in the performance text at the level of characters and performers, and in the reception at the level of audience. The third chapter presents a discursive analysis of some of the selected literary texts of Kathakali. The literary text of Kathakali primarily was transferred from one generation to another as oral text, and most of the Kathakali exponents had only oral texts to focus on, draw from. As a product of a pro-patriarchal male psyche, the women characters in Kathakali lack agency. They are often portrayed as objects of erotic pleasure or dangerous elements to be controlled, or valuable currency for exchange for healthy political relations. Marital relations were confined to Padinya Padams and Padams which represented wish or need of the consorts. As a neoclassical text, Kathakali imitated the classics to magnify the mundane and acted as a corrective force, instigating moral codes and general virtue in the society of the time. An ideal hero, ideal masculinity, need to wage wars, protect women, and have to keep away from all kinds of indulgences. The conflict was mainly between different kinds of masculinities. In the society of Kerala, with its local warriors and kings, war had rose to the status of a performance, labeled under the names like Poitha, Mamangam, Angam, and with its own audience and performers. While analyzing the developmental history of the Attakatha literature, the face of Kottayam stories remains prominent. The four stories written by Kottayatha Thampuran acted as touchstones for the critics to analyze the value of any Attakatha. These 4 stories served as models for Attakatha writers regarding characterization, plot, structure, and the prominence given to the performance of Pacha, a shade of heroic but less aggressive masculinity. There was a portrayal of stereotypical characters like Draupadi in these texts. Along with this, these texts also came up with women of subjectivity and action, like Lalita, Urvashi. Among the two, Urvashi stands different as she resists co-option and mutilation. She does not fit into the character stereotype, the stereotype created for women characters in the text of Kathakali. Lalitas can be considered as a dangerous or liminal space in the text of Kathakali. A change in the ideal of masculinity is obvious with the advent of Ravana as a protagonist in stories like Raghava Pisharadi's Ravanodbhavam. Until then, Kati was won over by Pacha and had less prominence when compared to Pacha. But with the advent of such stories which celebrated this aggressive shade of masculinity, the aesthetic appeal for Kati rose in the mind of the audience of Kathakali. Ravana lost his image as a villainous character, and he came to be considered as a strong, prominent, heroic, if but a tragic hero in the minds of the audience of Kathakali. The ending of Attakathas also got restructured, which usually ended with marriage or death. Now, in these stories, these stories did not end with the death of Kati. The next phase, which created a fresh wave in the sensibility of Kathakali audiences, Unnai Warrior's Nalajaridam, day 1, 2, 3, and 4. Initially, Nalajaridam could not find much appreciation from the part of the audience, but as the years went by, Nalajaridam could win the audience with its strong characters. The characters in Nalajaridam appear as individuals, not as character prototypes. We see Nala and Damayanti, not Pacha and Minikka in Nalajaridam. The literary text of Kathakali here seems to break away from its classicism and accept individualism. When we go through the 4 stories, 4 Nalajaridam stories, we get 4 different Nalas and 4 different Damayantis. And this also posed a challenge to the actors who had to perform these roles. As a text meant for stylized and symbolic acting, not realistic acting, and as an enactment which involved subtleties, the literary text of Attakathas could not incorporate new themes. But at the same time, Nalajaridam could establish a fine rapport with its audience. In a survey of Attakatha literature, Pudana Moksham finds a different place with Kamsa, a villainous character, leading the first half of the story, and Pudana, a villainous woman, leading the second half of the story. Interestingly, the second half of the story is now played more. The whole action revolves around Pudana. She's a woman of action. At the same time, the beautiful sights of the village of Ambadi attracts her mind, and she is giving descriptions of these beautiful sights. The conflict is built up by Pudana and culminates with her death. She can be considered as a round character as she undergoes both physical and mental transformation as the story develops. Kottakal Nandakumaran Nayar's Mathura Dahanam comes up with a different shade of masculinity and femininity. The man-woman relationship is problematized, and its culmination quite surprises the audience. Mathura Dahanam can be considered as a Dravidian plot relocated using Aryan linguistic science. The characters, the protagonists in the story, are ordinary men and women, and the affairs that affect their life are quite mundane. The protagonist in the story, Kannagi, is a round character, is a dynamic character. She undergoes both physical and mental transformation as the story develops, as she begins with a woman of insight who can plan out for the survival of her family, and ends up with her venturing out to avenge the death of her husband. Here she does not change into Kali, which is the usual technique used in Atakadas, where a woman transforms into a goddess. She here, Kannagi here, performs the action herself as an ordinary woman without resorting to the help of any external agency. She resists appropriation. Kannagi in the story of Mathura Dahanam resists appropriation. How does a woman or the text deploy the performance strategies in Kathakali is evident from the 3 stories written by Kutti Kunju Tangachi. Among the 3 stories, Parvati Swayamvaram stands different in its treatment of characters as individuals, not as prototypes. Parvati and Shiva in the story appear as individuals with their identities, and they are not confined to the character prototypes. But her other 2 stories are like the stories written by male authors in characterization, plot, structure, and motives used. A close analysis of characterization, structure, plot, motives, and tropes used in these Atakadas help us to understand the gender construction at the level of literature in the text of Kathakali. Women's sexuality is seen with suspicion. There is what should be a beautiful woman is also defined using words in these Atakadas. What is an ideal space for a woman to be in is also indicated in these Atakadas. Most of the women characters appear in the familial and private space, and if they venture out, there are transgressions, they meet up with dangers. Motives of abduction, Swayamvaram, femme fatale, objectification of women's body, erotic women's body as source of erotic pleasure, susceptibility of women to temptations, punishment of women who are overtly sexual, punishment of men who cannot overcome the sexual overtures of these women, are all repeated themes in the Atakadas. When the literary texts allocate spaces for the characters, the performance text tell them how to move in those spaces. So next chapter, the 4th chapter, is about the construction of gender at the performance level, which works at the level of characters and performers. The training in Kalari, along with the culture of Tauryatrigam, construct the performative body of performers which perform various roles. The space of Kalari, where men are given rigorous training, still remains a masculine space. The space of Kalari is controlled by a trainer who usually belongs to upper caste, who is a man of upper caste, and also trainees who are mostly men from upper castes. The construction of a performer's body in the Kalari as a performative instrument to make them fit to perform various roles with music and percussion, complemented with music and percussion in costumes and makeup. The military-like training in Kalari transforms the body and mind of the performer, imposing or rewriting on them performance traits or performance body, which acts on itself, tuned by strenuous training in the coloring. In spite of the performance, in spite of the fact that women have made their presence felt in the field of Kathakali, a full-fledged Kalari system accommodative of women is still not open for them. The argument is that women's bodies, it is not suitable for the exercises, body massage are not suitable for women's bodies. But the kind of training given to women in other art forms in India and abroad, like opera or ballet, seem to invalidate this argument. The performance aspects, like costumes, makeup, based on the gender character prototypes, Pachakati, Kari, Tadi, and Minika, rendering of mudras, choreography, music, and percussion are analyzed to sketch gender patterns defined in the text. The performance of Kari obliquely subverts gendering in the text. Kari represents monster women. The attempts of women who belong to this category to become beautiful according to the standards drawn by the upper caste society inadvertently results in a mockery or a parody of the gender concepts, beauty concepts of the society. Usually beauty concepts are defined by upper caste men in a society. Indeterminate performance of gender is hinted in the performance of characters like Chitrangada, Brihannala, Chitralekha. By characters, they belong to specific genders, but their performance in Atakadas like Chitrangada, Uttara Swayamaram, and Banayuddham respectively make them transgressors in gender rules. The performance of Brihannala in Kathakali is clearly masculine, as it is considered as, Brihannala is considered as a disguise of Arjuna, and Arjuna's masculinity cannot be questioned even when he performs actions which do not befit a male. N.V. Krishnavarya's Chitrangada is a heroine who resists the ideal heroine usually seen, the stereotype of an ideal heroine usually seen in the Atakadas. She performs a masculine role in the Atakada and is not comfortable with being an ideal male or a female. She appears in 3 different gender roles. Initially, she comes as a man clad in man's costumes and performs deeds which are quite manly. Then she comes as a woman who is not very feminine. Then in the end, she comes as a woman who is feminine and quite attractive. Each of the time, she questions the gender concepts and the roles related with each gender. Chitralekha can be considered easily identified as a woman at the primary level. She initiates the action in the story. She's a woman of action. Unlike in most other Atakadas, abdiction is performed here by a woman when Chitralekha abducts Prince Aniruddha for her friend Usha. Her affection and bonding with Usha also crosses usual borders of friendship. Such a companionship is rare in Atakadas. 2 texts, an interview and a documentary, Kalivilakkinte Idampadi, on the contribution of Kottakal Shivaraman to the field of Kathakali, prove the role of the performers in the construction of gender in the performance text of Kathakali. Being a performer who used to perform female roles, Kottakal Shivaraman could easily find appreciation of the Kathakali audience with his graceful appearance, which went along with the definition of women in the male psyche. But at the same time, his treatment of the characters went out of the way as they tried to find a place for themselves, which was unusual in the field. His heroines claimed equal space with the heroes on stage. The status of the treatment of male performers who performed female roles also changed to a certain extent with Kottakal Shivaraman's interventions. The gender performance at the level of actors is further explicated in the text Begum Panikkar, a play written by Kumaravarma. The attitude of the society towards a male performer who performs female roles is explicated in the text. The gender roles assigned to such men in the society within the text seems to problematize the sexuality of these men. The roles of Kari and Lalita are highlighted. These characters are considered by the protagonist Begum Panikkar as powerful women characters within the stylized, highly demanding performance text of Kathakali. Thus, this play problematizes both the status of the actors who perform female roles and also the usual audience reception of the performance of Kari and Lalita. Even with the presence of prominent artists like Chavara Parukutti Amma, the audience reception of the performance of women artists is still biased, and they are not considered at par with male performers. After interviewing some of the major artists, women artists of the day, of the present day, some major summations are arrived at. Most of these artists stressed that they had to face many challenges as women and women performers, and they could overcome these challenges with familial support. These artists brought in innovations and improvisations in the field of Kathakali, and at times problematized or subverted the stereotypical rendering of certain characters. But even with all this, there was evidently an imperviousness to their performance among the Kathakali audience. The last chapter analyzes the reception of the text of Kathakali. It is a masculinity or femininity that one wants to see, that one sees, construes, and enjoys in the text of Kathakali. The construction of gender at the level of audience is in conformation with the gender paradigms of the society of their time. As a performance text of Kathakali has undergone process of evolution, so the expectations and reception of the text also vary, defining, redefining, negotiating, most of the time perpetrating hegemonic upper class patriarchal sensibilities. As specimens for the audience text, a few articles written by some prominent art critics are taken and analyzed. A unique transforming art by Mulk Raj Anand, types of characters by O.M. Anujan, the impersonal in Kathakali makeup by T.M.P. Nedangadi, Kathakali, a brief account of its origin, growth and content by M.K.K. Nair, Kottayam Kathakal by V. Vijayan are some of the articles which analyze the performative aspects and characterization in Kathakali. They stand by the gender paradigms of the society. Two articles show the change in masculinity ideal as represented in the performance text of Kathakali. S. Gupta Nayar's Ravana Vijayam Kathakali, Natakathail, and Imanan Krishna Kaimal's Kathakaliile Kaplingadan Parikshanangal. Manoj Kuru's Sharirathinte Sangeetham is an article which focuses on the performance of two major artists, Kalamandalam Ramankutti Nayar and Kalamandalam Gopi. In this article, he explicates that performative bodies of these performers define and redefine the gender performance representation in Kathakali. Bhavani Kripa Kadaksham by artist Raju is an article which shows the change in the status of women characters with the performance of Kottakal Shivaraman. Sudha Shrikumar's Damayanti, P. Kunyikrishna Menon's Stritvam Nalajarithilam Dakshayagathilum, CMD Namboodiripat's Kathakaliile Stri Kathapatrangal are some articles which deal with the women characters in Kathakali, still repeating the gender stereotypes. Kottam Vidatha Stri Kathapatrangal by Hena Chandran is an article which problematizes gender stereotyping in Kathakali. K. Ammani's article, Kathakali Shlogangal, explicates the effectively describes various shlokam used in the Artakadas, which is a clear evidence of the scholarship of the author. The contribution of lower caste men to the field of Kathakali is a rarely discussed topic, and Vattaparambil Gobinatha Pilla discusses this rarely discussed topic in his article Avarnarum Kathakali. Along with these audience texts, another text is analyzed which show the interface of audience text and performance text. Kavalam Narayana Panikkar's Maratham is a play which problematizes the tuning of the sensibility of the Kathakali audience with the performance text. Every audience does not see the same performance in the same way. They read their biases, prejudices, and expectations and experiences in it. The audience texts are determined by the socio-cultural conditions which take the argument back to the initial chapters. It's like a vicious circle. Gendering in the field repeats and replicates, but a disavowal with patriarchy at times liberates the gendered spaces in Kathakali. Two conclusions arrived at through a discursive analysis of the text of Kathakali are: even though the text of Kathakali is replete with gendered spaces, they get negotiated at times by the presence of lacunae in the form of characters like Urvashi, Chitrangada or Kannagi, in the form of performers like Kottakal Shivaraman, Chavaraparukutiyamma. The gender performance in Kathakali, the gender performed in Kathakali, a performative gender at the level of characters and performers, is dynamic and not monolithic, and gives a spectrum instead of two parallel lines of masculinity and femininity. Thus, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that lovely exposition. I thought I'll start off by pointing out some positives and negatives of your work. As I told you earlier, I appreciated the work you have put into it, which I thought also showed a certain kind of involvement with the art form, a certain kind of personal involvement with the art form. That I will reserve for the question session. I want to ask you whether you yourself are a performer. Okay. You can maybe give me a more detailed reply later, but before that I'll just make clear my own reflections on your thesis. I like the way in which you have used language. It's lucid, it's direct. Yeah. It does not, complicate thought. Your use of words. But I felt that, there is too much of detailing. Especially too much of detailing in relation to plot and character. Okay. That is one positive and negative for you. The second thing is you have made a consistent effort That is the positive. You have made a consistent effort to give theoretical framings to whatever you have observed in the art form that you are trying to come to grips with, as a scholar, which is definitely a positive. But there are also, certain kinds of exclusions which have crept in. For example, Kathakali as an art form, how does it actually deal with transgender characters? What is the kind of framing you would give, theoretical framing you would give to an art form which has been mostly with notions of femininity and masculinity? You have used words like liminality and all that, but fluid spaces of gender. Where will you trace it in the art form? Except perhaps in 1 or 2 or 3 characters, but there also the shifting, the constant shifting is from masculinity to femininity. Is there a trans space for gender? That is something which one can be with, the idea of whether it allows fluid spaces. That can be examined, that can be thought through. One other positive that I find in your thing is the kind of ideas you have put in your 4th chapter. That is my favorite chapter in your work. I have reservations about, you're postponing the literature review to the last chapter. It is a way in which you can break conventions of thesis writing, but then it will be more clear to your reader if you actually make it evident in the beginning itself as to what the gap you have found is, where you would really want to get in and make, an argument, an announcement, etc. So that was missing, because in a way you were in a hurry to get into the theory of performance in the first 2 chapters. But if you had actually paused a little and justified this wanting to get into the theory of performance, as far as this art form is concerned, saying that, look, there have not been very many attempts so far to do this for you, and thus establish the relevance of your thesis, and then proceed, through the argument, chapter by chapter, it would have been more effective. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
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 Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So very many positives, because I know that people may not have attempted, critics may not have attempted a study of this length and, such a comprehensive analysis of whatever you could possibly examine under the umbrella of gender. That kind of study, maybe nobody has attempted so far. They would have actually stayed with certain kinds of questions and then tried to probe as much as they can through articles, isolated, attempts at thinking through absences, presences, etc. But yours is thoroughly comprehensive because it talks about, the women performers, women writers of Atakatha, women who do chutti, women who do percussion, and so on. So there is an attempt at, trying to get at all available spaces, that can be opened up for gender by Kathakali. There is definitely an attempt, but the negative side of that is when you tend to be all too comprehensive, that itself becomes a weakness. It's like you are trying to, get at everything possible. But because of that, an in-depth analysis becomes impossible of any one parameter of observation that you have made. Like that. Okay, so I appreciated your analysis of characters like Chitrangada, Brahandala, Chitralekha, even in Madhura Dahanam, I think, which is written by, is it written by your father?
Yes, sir.
Yes? Yeah, because I remember, something like that, the name suddenly reminded me of a reference that you have made. So, Kannaki, the character Kannaki, but Kannaki is still a very conventional character in a way, because she is somebody who decides to be very submissive or is naturally submissive to her husband, and as a result of that, she gets the power of the Pativrata, which helps her burn the city. So she doesn't actually need gods and goddesses to help her with that. It is the inner fire which is lit as a result of the Pativrata status that she seems to, symbolize. But I think you also mentioned it in passing that, this character is both conventional and traditional at the same time. Of the three characters, Chitrangada is perhaps the most interesting of the lot. And then another character that you mentioned when you were talking about some other Atakatha where the character Urvashi becomes so very different from all the other characters. But still, what I'm trying to tell you is They are all either masculine or feminine. They are all either men or women, or men who perform female roles and get identified as feminine, etc. So the fluid spaces or the multiple gendering that people like Butler would talk about would perhaps be absent in Kathakali. I will also, perhaps, wind up this exercise on positives and negatives by asking you the first question, which is, are you a performer? What is your personal involvement with the art form? Are you ready to answer?
Ma'am, can you repeat the question? It got cut in the on the way. Can you repeat the last question which you asked?
Are you a performer yourself? What is your personal involvement with the art form?
Okay. Yes, I have performed, and whenever I perform, I had this questions coming in my mind, a conflict, you may say, that for a woman who have done exercises in feminism and gender studies, if you have to still represent stereotypical women characters, it becomes quite difficult. And when I shared, or when I interviewed other women artists of the day, they seem to be sharing the same opinion. And the answer I got was that, yes, there may be spaces left for us to explore if we continue to perform and bring in new improvisations and innovations. So usually Kathakali is taken as a art form which has evolved, and its evolution is complete, and it is complete in itself. So we need to continue this process of reforming the text in our own way, the way of improvising characters, the way of introducing new stylized techniques within the text. So put in our own knowledge to the knowledge system of Kathakali, and slowly, gradually change the sensibility of the Kathakali audience. Most of them are not used to such kind of treatment of women characters. So when performers like Kottakal Shivaraman brought in innovations, there were many criticism. And how to establish a performance tradition, if it is to be appreciated by the audience who share the masculine point of view, who have a patriarchal ideology in their mind, is very difficult. So do it, and then let us come to new things. That is the conclusion I got as a performer. You may not be accepted by everybody. You may have to face lots of criticisms, but as a woman, this is important. To fight is important. To redefine oneself is important. To gain access to new fields is important. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yeah, I just wanted you to tell me how, you have this kind of involvement with the topic, and I think you have satisfactorily answered, my
Okay.
question. Um, there is an associated curiosity that I have, which is related to your thesis title, Beyond the Literary. We all know that Atakathas are literary texts, and actually the performance has nothing to do with the literary text in a way, because it is a performance text that decides, the critical interpretation of the literary text. So the performance text has the role of a director of a play, because the interpretation is. Do you think there are women who have written performance texts, or are all performance texts written by men?
Um, are you asking about Atta Pragaram or?
Yeah,
There are.
Atta Pragaram is the performance text, I think. So usually, it will be decided by whoever teaches as to what the Atta Pragaram would be. But are there instances where, this critical interpretation has been boldly carried out by women, where they have insisted on being authors of performance texts also while they perform?
I have not come across such women authors of performance text, I mean Atta Prakarams. There may not be explicit involvement of women in creating such texts, but when performers like Chavara Parukutiyamma, when I interviewed her, what she told regarding the fact was that we perform what our teachers taught us, and the teachers were usually men. And to change this pattern, you need to be a teacher yourself. So she taught some students, and through that, she gained a practical knowledge of the techniques and nuances of Kathakali, the grammar of Kathakali. So that has begun, the process has begun, and for us it is to continue with it. Surely there will be Atta Prakaram writers among women. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm just trying to learn from you because I don't know. So you have in the thesis mentioned, women authors of Attakathas, but there was no mention of Atta Prakarams written by women. So in my mind, I just got curious over whether it gets done at all. So I'm actually trying to learn from you whether there have been attempts like that. Okay. Another thing that I wanted to ask you is something related to the way in which you have given the details of stories and characters. Even before you take up the analysis of a text or a performance or an interpretation, etc. To me, it seemed that it dilutes the argument a lot, because the assumption is that the reader will not know the story, and therefore the story has to be laid bare even before the analysis can be conducted. Did you have a problem with the English audiences of your thesis?
No. Shall I answer? Shall I answer?
Yes.
What I thought was that
Yes.
with the descriptions of the story, my attempt was to show how the authors deviated in the Artakathas from the familiar version of the stories. So when you come across a story and then know the deviations of the Artakatha writers, it would be easier to know how they manipulated these stories to showcase a particular shade of masculinity or femininity, which they wanted to show the audience. So to show such deviations, I tried to bring in the plot and see how the familiar text is, the Artakatha text is diverging from the familiar versions of the story. Then, as you have told, I worked under the tension of addressing a heterogeneous audience, and this tension persists throughout the text. That how far will the audience be knowing about not Arjuna or Bhima as characters, but as Arjuna and Bhima in Kathakali. So to communicate the nuances of the text of Kathakali, there were attempts, and for a person who is familiar with such nuances, it will be felt as descriptive.
I have a suggestion, like if you are thinking of publishing this as a book, because I'm sure many people will, benefit from a study like this. Maybe you can make it more argumentative. That's a suggestion, because then it will be condensed, it will be more condensed, it will be less lengthy, and therefore the dilution which has happened here will not happen and it will be a scholarly work of repute. Okay, so this is a suggestion that I have for you. If you had a foreign examiner, I can understand. Foreign examiner who didn't know the art form as to why so much of description had to be given, in relation to plot, details of character, etc. And the preliminaries of, these Pachakati, Minukku forms. But I always tell my students that you should assume that your reader is somebody who knows, the basics of what you're talking about. Only then can a contribution be made, because otherwise you'll be going back and forth, growing tense over whether people will actually understand what you're talking about, etc. And in English studies, it always happens, because we are also dealing with all kinds of texts in English studies, maybe, regional, local texts. And then most of the time, we are tense that the person who reads us may not actually know the basics of what we are talking about. And therefore, there is an attempt at detailing the regional or the local. Okay. So maybe, you can think about it. I'm actually talking about a later phase when you may want to publish it in the form of a book, etc. But this is my suggestion for you. Okay. Now, I think from my side, I have actually spent all my questions and curiosities on you and your work, and therefore I'll keep the floor open for discussion. I think there is a question-answer session to follow our conversation.
Yes, you can.
Can anyone?
Chitra,
Yes,
you can.
Yeah.
there is. It's opening up for the audience.
So if there are questions from the audience for Aathira, please address it. Please address your questions and doubts to the one who can perhaps answer.
Yes, hello,
all the
Aathira.
questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, first of all, let me express my wonder and appreciation at the kind of, the range of your subjects and the extremely complex topic that you have handled. And I'm not an expert in this area at all, although I love Kathakali and I watched a lot of performances, but I don't think I can go into the technicalities of Kathakali. But at the same time, I was just wondering, I don't know whether really it comes within the purview of your thesis as such, but something which crossed my mind while I was going through your abstract and as I was listening to you, you talk about, we talk about how the great struggle that the women performers had to make in the Kathakali art, where they were allowed to perform. The very fact that they could perform, that itself was a great struggle, isn't it? Because it was men who were doing the women's roles also. But has there been a conversation, has any discussion been raised about when women start performing, not just women's roles, but also the men's roles? Because I have heard about all women group performing a Kathakali, a particular story. You understand? It's not all women group. So has there been any kind of a discussion or any kind of a what do I say? Any kind of a comment or observations that are made regarding, or any studies for that matter, regarding what do these women performers go through when they enact a male role? Because what I'm trying to say is, I don't know that I'm being clear, because I've seen so many documentaries, films and discussions regarding how Kotakil Shivaraman, when he was doing the women's roles, was considered to be really absolutely magnificent at that. I've heard him speak, directly on the subject. Much has been written about that, the kind of gender bending, particularly among the feminist scholars of performance and art, etc., regarding the kind of gender bending that takes place when he enacts the role of women. Has there been any kind of discussion regarding when these women performers, women artists, Kathakali artists started performing the men's roles, about the kind of that, a very complex gender experience that takes place there? Have there been discussions? Because I find that in Kerala's public sphere, there is a lot of discussion when a male dons a female role, but not the in the reverse. So I was just wondering that. That was one question. Another is that in the beginning, Chitra was talking about you being a performer, and I'm curious to know how has this journey of research impacted your performance? How would it impact your performance in future? I'm not sure whether I've been very clear, but this best I could manage. Yes.
First, to the first question, as I have mentioned in the thesis, there are some women performers whom I have interviewed, like Ranjini Tripunithara, Priya Nambudiri, who is based in Mumbai. When I shared my experiences with these women performers, what they told was that they had to be men, or they had to imagine themselves to be men when they perform a male character, because there is a prejudice on the part of the audience that this character is played by, male character is played by a woman performer. So they were biased and they had to perform before this biased audience. And these performances were widely appreciated by the audience, whether it is Ranjini or whether it is Priya Nambudiri. The thing is that they had to meet the standard already set by male performers. So it is again dancing to the already set pattern, but even then they were appreciated as successful performers. And when I asked about their personal feelings regarding performing as a male, Ranjini Tripunithara made an interesting comment that when she looked at the female character who is standing to her left, she looked at her as a man would look at, or as the look or the gaze in the Kathakali text ask us to look at, as an erotic body, as a describing all the physical features of the woman. So it was a transformation which had to be done to make the performance successful. That is what Ranjini told me. And in the Aathira also, she was treated as a male because her features are masculine, as she herself told, and she is considered equal to other male performers. It was a different experience to listen to her words. And when Priya Nambudiri shared her experiences, when she performed Hanuman or Ravana, the character of Ravana, she said that it was difficult to do the alarcha. We are used to men who roar on the stage. That sound is familiar to us. But when women do this alarcha, it is quite a squeaky voice which audience does not want to hear. So that part was quite difficult according to her. Otherwise, she was satisfied with the body movements she could master. And these masters are all men, and the standard is already set by men. So it is a struggle that women performers undergo, whether they are performing the role of a male character, whether they are performing the role of a female character. They undergo this conflict. It is already defined by the male authors or male composers of the text. There are indeed successful performers who do, women performers who do male characters. Then to the second question, as a performer, this journey through my thesis has enabled me to see the texts, see characters, improvise my own performance the way I need to do it. May not be so successful because it may diverge from the standard set by the masters, but at the same time, I could overcome the conflict in the mind to a certain extent. There are still conflicts, as Chitra ma'am has mentioned regarding characters like Kannagi. When Kovalan returns after his affair with Madhavi, Kannagi accepts him. Why should she accept him? Why should she just stand and listen to all his woes and then just look for a remedy? That was a problem for me. So how to bring in my own Kannagi to it was a difficult thing. It was not permissible in the Padanya Padams of Atakadas. So how to, you cannot shout on Kovalan, you are a Pativrata, you have to be obedient, but at the same time you're not satisfied with the situation. So at least you can express this, that dissatisfaction with your husband's relation, extramarital relations. So there are such instances which make us question ourselves and question the women roles portrayed in Kathakali. There are many more things to say. I don't know if I'll be more descriptive.
I perfectly understand it's a very vast topic, and in one question answer session, it's not going to get exhausted. So anyway, I mean, I think you've done a great work, and I'm really looking forward to reading the thesis. I just want to ask you, did this particular interviews that you mentioned now with Ranjini and Priya, are they all included in your thesis, these aspects? Yeah, okay. So then I think I'll get some clarity when I read the thesis. Thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions? Questions from the audience? No questions? I have one more question for you, Aathira. Actually, I think towards the end of your thesis, you also talk about, the class caste equations that Kathakali has always carried with it, and how there have been resistances from people like Karatapura and all that. Okay, I want to know whether there has been any change actually. Despite the resistances, have these equations actually, changed, because it still belongs to a class caste category. The way in which Kathakali is looked at as an art form. So these many resistances which have been offered by people, from various quarters, has it made a difference to the way in which the art form is perceived? If not, why?
What I felt was that there are some changes because with the institutionalization of Kathakali, it has shifted from Kali Yogams, and it has become part of institution, and it is accessible for everybody, irrespective of caste and class. They are given stipends, and they are not perceived with the same kind of racial prejudice, caste prejudice, at least in such institutions. And there are men performers as actors, as singers, as chutti makeup artists. There are performers in Kathakali from various caste categories, but it's not, even though it is not explicitly casteist, but there are demarcations based on, at least in the mind of people, they are not so receptive to such performers.
Thank you. I was also, in a way, giving time to the audience to think about the questions that they need to ask. Any more questions? If there are no more questions, shall I wind up?
I'm sorry, it doesn't look like there's usually not the case. There are quite a few questions.
No, but Narayan, because Kathakali is not a very familiar terrain, that may be the reason why.
But gender ought to be a very familiar terrain.
That might be one reason. I mean,
or maybe all of them are Aathira's friends and they don't want to
yeah, that
question
is
her
a
on anything.
strong reason. That's usually the case. They're all there to protect her and support her. That's the thing.
Yes.
That could be one good reason, yeah.
How is it usually? Do I declare the results now? Or is there a more formal
usually that's what
declaration? Yeah.
Unless there are any more questions.
I think Pratibha wanted to say something. I saw the mic.
This is the last.
Pratibha?
Yes, I was just joining Janaki's opinion that this is not everyone's cup of tea. That's why people are like keeping a little away. Yeah, I was just wanted to join there. And Chitra, hi to you. All right. So congrats to Aathira and Narayanan also. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, I wish to declare the results of the Viva straight away. I'm mightily impressed by the work and also the immensity of work that has been taken up by Aathira. And I realize that it will be a contribution to the field of this art form. And for people who wish to know more about gender spaces in Kathakali, this will be pioneering work. I'm sure, lots of people can take ideas from Aathira and, work at definitive topics in future within the ambit of gender itself. But you have done great pioneering work, and you have also brought an art form with all its complexities to the English studies realm, and therefore you deserve to be awarded, the PhD degree in English studies.
Thank you, ma'am.
So congratulations, Aathira Nandan. Congratulations to my friend Narayanan, who has been with her in her journey. Congratulations.
Okay. Aathira, would you like to say something, after which I'll go for the vote of thanks?
Okay, a few words. It was indeed a great privilege to work under such a scholar as Dr. M.V. Narayanan. His insights, the insights he gave me during the research, helped me throughout, and it has inspired me to do more work even after this separation of thesis. Thanks to all my family members and my colleagues and my dear friends who have attended and who have helped me to in the process of writing this thesis. Thanks to Chitra ma'am, thanks to all those who have attended, thanks to the English department of Calicut University. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aathira. Sharif?
Yeah.
Sharif, are you saying?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Before I go into the vote of thanks, since as a supervisor, I'm expected generally to keep completely mum during the proceedings. I was squarely chastised some years back by C.T. Indira when I inadvertently opened my mouth and she slapped my wrist and shut up. So since then, I've usually maintained a complete silence whenever the viva of my student is. There are a couple of things that before the vote of thanks, I just wanted to add. A couple of questions. That one is Chitra, that one Chitra asked, another one that Janaki asked. Chitra's question is very relevant, and I think it was there in Aathira's dissertation. She probably did not remember that, whether there are women authors of performance texts. The whole problem is that when Kathakali it's a group medium, and it is not as if individuals can bring in huge changes in it, because it always maintains a certain balance, and that can be done only in consultation with and in cooperation with the other people. And such innovations have been brought by women. But the stories of such innovations are very curious. I'll give you one example, that is of Rathika Varma, one of the foremost women actors of the 20th and 21st century. In Nalajaridham's second day's play, there is a particular scene where Nala, after being banished, having lost his kingdom, being banished, he turns around, is about to curse, and then changes that curse into a blessing. This particular piece of act, which is highly dramatic, this is probably nothing to do with gender, but this is highly dramatic and it's so appropriate for that particular point of time, was brought in by Rathika Varma. And then Gopi Ashan started using that. But today, that particular innovation is known in Gopi Ashan's name. Rathika Varma's name has disappeared. So whatever women have written, they usually also appropriate it. And it is inevitable that when you're performing, these innovations do come in, but they are rarely. The second thing is what Janaki said about, about the Janaki asked, again, Chitra asked the question of class and caste. One interesting thing, if you look at very closely, is that there is a very clear binary divide between the people who are patrons, people who watch Kathakali, and people who are actually performers. The performers may belong to so-called, they belong to, may belong to upper caste, but they are an underclass. Invariably, they are an impoverished underclass. Even today, when Kathakali has become institutionalized, people who go for Kathakali or learn Kathakali and turn it into a profession are not people who belong to the middle class or the upper classes. They are always an underclass. So effectively speaking, interestingly enough, one would find the male actors in Kathakali almost, if not the same kind, but a very similar kind of oppressed situation as women. The only difference being that, or the substantial difference being that, in the women's case, it is doubly more oppressed. They are an underclass, and on top of that, they are a women too. The fact of being a performer makes you an underclass, effectively speaking. Anyway, I just want to add that. And then again, when Aathira said she didn't want to accept Kovalin's diktats, I'm reminded of Usha Nangyar in Kuriyatam, who told me when she was doing her Ahalya, she completely changed the story. According to Ramayana, Ahalya is supposed to finally live out her life in peace and bliss after being delivered from the state of a stone by Rama's feet. She is supposed to live the rest of her life with her husband Gaudama. And Usha's question was, how can I live with that man? I don't want to live with that man. So the performance ended after she was that was over at that point of time. So there are interventions. There are very strong interventions which come out from gender conflicts or identity issues where the performer and the role are in conversation or in conflict, so to speak. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. One thing is, I have an apology to make to Aathira. This is a Viva which is so late, not because of the fault of any of us, because generally the university has been so late in fixing these things up, in sending it out. It's almost 2 years now since she has submitted a dissertation. That's just too late. So I do apologize to Aathira for this delay. And thank you, Chitra, for being so kind to value the dissertation and read it threadbare, with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm sure that Aathira will take your criticisms very seriously. And definitely she should be planning to publish that, incorporate those suggestions, those corrections, so that the book becomes a much more viable and contributory book, so to speak, scholarly attribute. Thank you very much, Chitra, for coming for this and spending your time for this. And thank you, Sheriff, for arranging everything.
My pleasure.
And thank you everyone who participated. And thanks for the questions from Janaki. I was expecting more questions from others. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But thanks a lot. Thanks a million to everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Chitra. So there was a question I had thought of asking, forgot. It is there in the chat box. There are no retakes in open defenses like in life. So this can be left unanswered for the timing. I was thinking of Atta program. So where women could have made an intervention. This is probably okay. This is a question for the future, not now. Okay. So thank you, Chitra. Thank you, Naran. Thank you, Aathira. Thank you, everybody else here. Chitra, just to remind you, I will be sending those 2 forms for you to sign and return. I will be sending it by mail. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all of you. A pleasure being with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.